Welcome to this month's segment of Key to the Pastcast. I am Megan Reed.
And I am Ryan McLennan.
And we both work for the Trumbull County Historical Society. Thank you all so much for joining in today. Before we jump into this month's topic, I would like to send a shout out to this season's sponsors. The Community Foundation of the Mahoning Valley and Ohio Humanities graciously sponsor this podcast this season.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely. They're wonderful. Before we dive into this month's episode, Ryan and I are going to talk a little bit about the different resources that we have at the Trumbull County Historical Society and beyond for researching the flats in Warren. You'll hear Reverend Johnson mention the flats area many times within this interview, particularly because the original Second Baptist congregation was located in the flats. And for anybody that's listening that might have a family history of past ancestors who would have lived there, even if you're just interested in learning more about urban renewal in an area that was really decimated during the 1960s, 70s, 80s, we've been doing a lot of work with that at the Historical Society the last few years, and I'd like to just throw out some options that you can look at. The first one would be the Warren Raised Project, Warren, RAZED.org. A few years ago, we created a partnership with the Trumbull County Land Bank and the City of Warren to map Warren's raised structures. And a huge part of that project was taking the urban renewal records from the city's community development department. So many of the homes and businesses that were located in the flats during urban renewal, they took photos of those buildings before they were demolished, and we scanned, digitized, and then mapped those photographs on a website. So I highly recommend that you check that one out. There's also some research resources on that website that look at the people who owned those buildings when they were purchased during urban renewal before they were torn down, and lots of maps. So definitely check that out. The Voices Oral History Project is another one that the Historical Society started, oh my gosh, it's been so long, like 2017, I believe.
Yeah, I think that sounds right. It's either 17 or 18.
Yeah, it was in that time frame. The Historical Society partnered with a variety of interviewers throughout Warren to specifically focus on preserving the experiences of elders within Warren's Black community. Those interviews, I think we're currently up to, like 30 people.
It's between 25 and 30.
Yeah.
Yeah, something like that.
Mm-hmm. Interviews that are curated onto a website where you can go and listen to firsthand experiences by subject, like segregation or the civil rights movement or family and traditions or local businesses. So that's a great resource for both local residents, but also for teachers. And that's voicesoftc.org. That's the website, the URL to Google. Yes. Yeah. And then the last thing that I'd like to mention on the research side is a project that was really driven by Kent State students over the last couple of months, actually. The students at Kent in their geography department put together a map of all of the businesses within the flats from 1961, and also did a ton of research on the businesses that were there and the homes that were there and just urban renewal in general. And that link is longer than I'm going to say for you to type in right now. So we're going to take that link. It's a story map website and drop it in our show notes so that you can take a look at that and view that one as well.
Yeah, we'll do that with Voices as well, and with Warren Raised. Yeah. You can also find Warren Raised and Voices of Trumbull County through our main webpage. Mm-hmm. All right, now on to the interview.
Reverend Todd Johnson. Mm-hmm. We're super happy to have Reverend Todd on. He is a native of Warren, was reared in the Christian faith, and baptized at Agape Assembly Church, where he preached his initial sermon at age 19. He later was appointed a church elder at 25 years old, and eventually succeeded his father, Reverend George H. Johnson Sr., as senior pastor, where he served faithfully for 3 years. In 2008, he graduated from Geneva College with a Bachelor of Arts in Community Ministry. He accepted the call to assume the pastorate of the Second Baptist Church and began his ministry here on Sunday, September 6th, 2015. Since accepting the call to serve at Second Baptist, he has spurred a renewed focus on community engagement and evangelism, upgrades to church properties, the use of social media for ministry outreach, and strong support and leadership of various neighborhood initiatives, such as the construction of the Highland Pride Playground and Picnic Pavilion in the Highland Terrace apartments adjacent to the church.
Pastor Todd Johnson has a longer bio that we can also share on our
Yes.
on our page.
It's about 2 pages, and I'm not going to read it all here, but he has a very impressive background, so we want to definitely make sure you have a chance to read that.
Read through it. Okay, so the interview with Pastor Todd Johnson. I think one of the highlights for me, I'm always sort of forward-looking, I guess. I don't know why I'm a historian in that way, but it's fine. Is that Pastor Todd talks a lot about where the church is going, and specifically his involvement with the youth in our community, which I think, as I said before, we'll highlight his bio on our page. But I think it's really sort of impactful in this interview, and I was sort of wanted to get your thoughts on that.
I completely agree. I think it's interesting in today's sort of age, if you will, when, so many churches are closing and there's so many congregations that are struggling with membership. We hear that kind of across the board, right? That there's like strong communities that churches can form, and the flexibility, right, and the agility to switch from not maybe necessarily not being 100% about the evangelism and more about community-driven, community-mindedness, and really helping the people in your areas, right? And I'm impressed by what Second Baptist has been able to do there.
Same.
I also think it's super interesting. This is sort of maybe a more personal note, that I very much relate to the idea that Pastor Todd is, kind of relatively speaking, a younger guy in a profession that, you really have to connect with people who are in generations older than you and be able to be patient and relate to them and connect different, across the generations to bring about, I don't know if I necessarily want to say change, but just goodwill among people, right? Mm-hmm. An understanding among people. And I get that, right? We do that all the time at the Historical Society. And I think Pastor Todd, I don't know, some of his congregation might be listening to this being like, I don't know what they're thinking. No. So it seems like he's done that very well.
No, I can only speak from a personal side, but as we were talking about before we got started with the interview, that's certainly something that we deal with sort of daily. And it's not deal with, it's a privilege of ours. And I think Pastor Johnson would agree. But there are challenges because essentially the older generations, there will be a time and point where they won't be here, right, anymore. And so it's about making sure we corral those stories, but then also how that transitions to younger generations, I think is really impactful and important for how we perceive ourselves and how our community perceives themselves going forward. So I don't know. I think Pastor Johnson gives us a really good example of doing that and forward thinking through that.
I agree.
One of the other takeaways that I had from the interview was talking about sort of the founding of Second Baptist, the moving of Second Baptist.
The history stuff.
All the history stuff, yeah. So I guess the part of my job that I need to actually pay attention to. But I wanted to ask you a little bit about what your takeaways, highlights were regarding those historical facts.
Oh my gosh. Right. Oh, I love that stuff. So it's been a really long time. But I was in the original chapel that still stands on Second Baptist Church's campus, the original one that was located in the Flats, probably going back to 2018, 19, I want to say. And it's absolutely beautiful. The church has done a great job of, maintaining it. I know they're currently working on funding to get get the stained glass windows installed and maintaining and making sure that they preserve the church. And I really appreciate that Second Baptist has put so much of their resources and time and their energy into making sure that their original building means something, right? It's valued by the community. And that has always struck me, that's something that they actively preserve. They didn't just let it, let's just move on to the more modern, newer building. And I think that's really awesome.
Yeah, the church leaders and the congregation themselves really, it was their effort. It was a joint effort, right?
Absolutely.
To keep this thing together, which is amazing.
Yeah. Well, do we want to get to it?
Yeah. Well, now we'd like to welcome Pastor Todd Johnson. Thank you.
All right. Well, welcome, Pastor Todd. We're happy to have you here.
I am thrilled to be here.
Thank you so much for coming.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Yeah, we're super excited to talk about Second Baptist today. So I'm going to start with kind of a lofty question, which I feel like might sound like it should be at the end. But you were born and raised in Warren.
Right.
Now you're the pastor of a very significant church here in town. What does that mean to you? What is it like to be the pastor of Second Baptist now?
You know what? It never ceases to be like this overwhelmingly humble and experience. I feel so honored to be able to serve in a capacity like this in the town that literally raised me. It's so much more than just some career aspiration or desire to have a successful ministry. The people that I serve are people that are a part of the formation of our community, the formation of our life, my life. And second, being a historic church in its own right. And I'm a big fan of history and Black history. And to be able to participate and be a link in the chain, I try to stay kind of fresh in my mind that it's such a privilege to be in that space and to try to add to the legacy that's so rich. It just means a lot to me. And I try to convey that even to others, especially people in my generation who might be with us in the church or have joined recently, that they're a part of something really special. And that's really a big honor for me.
Yeah. Can you give us a little bit of the trajectory? How did you land at the church? What was your journey to getting there?
That's interesting. I was one of those little kids, and I don't know how it exists in other cultures, but there's always a couple of kids in the Black community that like always want to be a preacher. And like they emulate the preacher like other kids emulate Michael Jordan. And I was that guy. I was that kid, 5 and 6 years old, mimicking the pastor when I was a kid. And then my father became the pastor of the church we were attending. And I was just like a church boy, really. But I took the ministry seriously, got into it as a teenager, became a minister at the age of 19. Went on through a normal career in life and college and getting a job and all of that, but kept serving at my father's church right here in Warren. And by 25, I became what we call an elder, which is almost like an associate or assistant minister of a church, and became the pastor of my father's church in 2012, which was a non-denominational, younger, more modern, contemporary, like everything Second Baptist wasn't when I came to it. It was like the opposite of that church. A lot of young people, only had been around like 30 some years at the time. And so I did that, but I also gained some great mentors and some seasoned individuals who saw some potential, encouraged me to go to school, get my bachelor's in ministry, which is a thing, and even encouraged me to get my master's, which I'm finishing up right now.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. Congratulate me in a year
You're almost there.
and when the bills are paid. But
That'll be longer than a year.
somehow this deep connection really started to build between myself and Second and my predecessor, who was the pastor there, Dr. Frank Hearns. And I would preach services for him, youth days, special occasions. And when he retired, I became a candidate kind of on their radar that they would like to speak to. And we had done some great things at my home church, a lot of outreach, a lot of reaching out to youth. And like a lot of churches, I think Second at the time, they were feeling a little aged, because that's really a trajectory a lot of churches take these days. And they kind of wanted to have an influx of some youthfulness and some vision. And I was willing to take on that challenge. I felt like God wanted me to step into that role, and they accepted me. And it was really dynamic because I wasn't raised in Baptist tradition. I wasn't a part of the Baptist denomination. So they accepted me coming in, even as a Baptist minister, having had a different tradition. And that was really great on their part. And I've been there now 8.5 years. And I think I'm the 13th pastor in the 107-year legacy of the church. And I'm just really grateful for how far we've come.
It's really remarkable.
Yeah, that is actually. Did you always, I know you talked about this, that when you were a youth, when you were a kid, you emulated the pastor, but did you feel a calling then, or did that come later when?
They would say in the Christian parlance, like there's just something special on your life or some anointing on your life or calling, words like that. And you could feel it. You always felt a little different. I think it really helped that I come from a devout family and that ministers go through my family. My great-grandfather, Bentley H. Dow, was the founder and pastor of the Main Street Church of God, which is now the York Avenue Church of God. They're about 90-some years old now. Wow. And so my father followed in his footsteps and his grandfather's footsteps, and then I followed in their footsteps. So it was always present with us. Being a pastor and a preacher was weird for me because I had a speech impediment and a stutter as a child. And some people can detect it here and there now, but most people wouldn't know it. So to be like speaking for a living, and that's all I do all the time, I definitely attribute that to the grace of God and my mother and grandmother who made me do lots of speech exercises and slow down. But there's just this desire to serve people. And because of the type of church I was raised in and my father and my mother, this idea of serving others and making an impact. And through the process of religion, even though it's not the most popular thing in the world anymore, I saw that as my path to making that impact. I wanted to be a teacher when I came out of high school and went to college for a few years for teaching. And I never got to that space, but I feel like I'm doing a lot of the same work of forming and educating and developing people, youth and adults, by pastoring.
To like kind of know like a little bit of what your trajectory is when you're young, I think that would be really helpful for like anybody, in my opinion. I don't know. I think that's really cool.
Yeah.
And I want to get to this question of community, and I want to dig into that a little bit more, but perhaps we can do that a little bit later.
Sure.
Can we circle back and talk about the history of the church?
Certainly.
And the significance of the church in the community, because the church is over 100 years old now.
Yes, founded in 1916, officially incorporated in 1917. Second Baptist Church is definitely a part of the Great Migration story of blacks migrating from the Mississippis, the Alabamas, the South Carolinas, the Louisianas. Those are some of the main states that occupy this part of the country. We have a lot of residents here who can literally all trace themselves back to the same county. Wow. You say to a lot of our residents, Crenshaw County, in different places. My grandparents were from Yazoo City, and my mother was born in Yazoo City, Mississippi, and we used to go there every summer. But in the early part of the 20th century, obviously black migrants coming up for jobs, for better conditions. Industry is flying around here. So you have your Warren, your Youngstown, your Akron, your Pittsburgh, your Chicago, your Detroit, and like wherever you land and plant stakes first is where you end up at. And enough people were planted in in Warren. And then in those days, if you were of a certain denomination or sort of persuasion of Christianity, you would look for a church. And if there wasn't one, you'd establish one. So as you know, there was a Methodist church already existing, Grace African Methodist Episcopal Church, but there was no Baptist church. And so it would just be uncouth for these good Baptists to come up here and go to a Methodist church, which is, it is what it is. So they established the Second Baptist Church. Now, it wasn't called Second Baptist. A lot of times it would just be the Baptist Church, and or the First Baptist Church. But they found out quickly there was already a First Baptist Church occupied mostly by Caucasians, obviously. And in those days, even up north, it was not normal for people to worship together. Particularly in Baptist denominations, same with Methodists, hence African Methodist Episcopal. So they established for a brief time, their name was Shiloh, and then they settled on Second. And that's actually a pattern all over the country. If you go into most cities, you'll find a Second Baptist church, and it's almost always a black church because our Caucasian brothers were here first. And so we just end up with Second and Third and Fourth Baptist Church. But they really carved out an identity as there was a rush of migrants coming this way and the black population was exploding. And there were other churches that began to get established in other parts of the city because in those days, churches weren't expected to be massive necessarily, just a gathering place for neighborhoods and communities. You're talking prior to cars, public transit and all of that. So if you had a church on the southwest side, that was mostly for your southwest residents or whoever could walk there. And so the first church was built at 109 Walnut Street, located in the Flats. The actual address is no longer there because that's one of the streets that was cut off and redeveloped as a part of the redevelopment in the 60s. But the first chapel was built there in 1919. And they really carved out a very successful existence and grew really fast and strong through the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s to the point where they needed to build a new church. So that kind of brought us to our location on Main Street. But it's really a story, of a lot of fortitude and strength, a lot of scrappiness. Nobody had much. If you didn't provide it out of your own sacrifice, it wasn't going to happen. You're not talking about a church full of lawyers, and that did come later. We ended up with a lot of individuals who did really great. But when things like the Depression hit, the church almost closed. It said in the late 20s, early 30s, the church almost shut down, and the minister at the time worked very, very hard, even giving up his own salary. I think he gave up his own salary for a time, and they would do things like dinners and scrape together different things to do their best, and at the same time serve people who were suffering around them. And I had the most wonderful experience at a Harding football game last year where a white gentleman said, "Are you Pastor Johnson from Second Baptist?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "I've been meaning to meet you and talk to you. Your church members back in the 30s assisted my grandparents who were immigrants in the Flats when they had no shoes and socks. And the black women of the church came out and made sure they had what they needed." And he said, "I never forgot that, and that story's been passed down to me, and I wanted to tell you about it."
I don't think Rick Fleischer would mind me putting him on the spot here, but he's told me that story.
He's told you that?
Well.
Oh, that's okay. I didn't want to say names, but yes. And that's just so special because African Americans, even in the North, had such a hard go. And so to think about the compassion that they lived out, even when their lives were under the gun in a lot of ways, is just amazing to their cultural fortitude and their spiritual strength.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out a way of phrasing this. I'd like to talk a little bit more about the Flats and how the first church started there. Are there any specific people that you can think of from those early days, the late teens, early 20s, even into the 30s, that you think were like the movers and shakers in the church or even in the community that should be said, like their names spoken? Does that make sense?
Thankfully I've done my research, and we're very careful to include those formative names in our history and, repeat them and recite them so that they're not lost, to history. J.H. Bailey was the first organizing minister. And in those times, they were like itinerant ministers who would just travel around and sometimes plant for a while to help start a church, or they would call on that minister to come and be their minister. So sometimes a group of people would just start a prayer meeting in a house, in a front room of someone's house. And then they would call for a minister to come and be their minister and their pastor. And J.H. Bailey was one of those, the person who's well known amongst the older members of our church. Lula Turner offered her house as the first meeting space for the church. And there are some other names like J.E. Robinson and Dan Wilson and Percy Foster and John Birch. There was another minister by the name of Thomas Wright who assisted at the time. Carrie Robinson is another name. And they even had services at the Union Savings Bank downtown for a season until they found a permanent home. And those are some of the individuals who were instrumental in building the first church. A little bit later on, we had some about 30s, 40s, 50s. We had some great names like Drydale Warfield. And if you know that last name,
Warfield,
then that is the father of Paul Warfield, who is still on our wall as one of the youth members back in the 50s.
Oh, that's great.
That's cool.
And he still returns when he comes to town. He comes to worship with us. And some other great, McLaughlin is another big name. William McLaughlin was another very prominent name. And in those 40s, 50s, 60s era, my own great-grandfather, great-uncle, Johnson, Harrison Johnson, we called him Hunter. And he was one of the primary trustees, and one of those, he was a business owner, owned a barbershop, and his wife owned a beauty salon. And they were one of the entrepreneurs that really sacrificed in big ways for the church to, alongside many, many others, for the church to be what it became.
Was there any particular movements during the civil rights movement that you'd want to point to, ways that the church was sort of pushing back or making moves locally there?
You know what? There's a lot of interesting kind of crosstalk on that subject. One of the things that has become more apparent to us kind of in an age of truth, so to speak, is that the civil rights movement was really a mixed bag for Black churches. It was not this kind of Disney fairy tale, here's Dr. King marching, let's all go join him kind of thing. There were a lot of Blacks and a lot of Black churches that refused to participate or saw it as an agitation and a disruption to the progress they were making. And there were a lot of churches up here, up north, and I'm certain and sure that over the course, not knowing exactly positions of certain pastors, that was a position of, don't bring the agitation here, we're doing well, we got out of the South, we have jobs, and that respectability argument was really big. I think sympathy grew over time, when media grows, the 50s, the 60s, seeing it. We did eventually have Dr. King's father actually come and preach at our church back in the 70s. But I was told that a lot of the activism didn't really start as strong until some certain pastors came to town, including Reverend Leon Troy, who was a young pastor like myself who came from Sandusky. And there was a lot of racism in these areas like Sandusky, Springfield, and of course in this area. And he gathered with other ministers and really became more vocal. And again, that was civil rights era, though. That's 60s. Everybody's getting bold at that time. But there aren't strong stories of marches and demonstrations. But we know that a lot of those stories end up getting lost to time. And a lot of times there's small victories. There are mistreatments, and the people gather and make sure that their children aren't mistreated anymore, or people that will not hire Blacks. There was a lot with the unions in the early times where, while that's a stronghold among Black communities now, unions often saw Black workers as a threat. And so that was a struggle in the steel mill days and all of that. So it's a mixed bag, and I think it's good for us being historically minded to make sure we put that nuance there, that there are a lot of people saying, hey, our kids are able to go to school, and after a while the schools are integrated and this, that. So why push the envelope too much? Stay to yourselves. And I think it bears mentioning that a lot of thriving communities were built where you didn't really need to force the issue because you had your own grocery stores and bars and barbershops and businesses, and it was just leave us in peace to live as we want to. And that was the perspective of some, that I'm not trying to run over and live over here or live over there or demand a spot where I don't really want to be either. And I think that gets lost in the civil rights conversation, that there are a lot of Blacks, especially our older ones, who still speak that way. I'd rather just have my own and stay to myself. And that doesn't sound popular anymore, but it was a reality because that was the reality they were born into.
You talked a little bit about outreach for the church. How do you see it? How was outreach in the past, and then how do you see it going forward? Sort of, it might be an unfair question, but I think no.
I think that's a great question. Most African American churches, Black Baptist churches especially, all have the same name, whether they mention it on their signs or branding or not, and it's missionary. So we are technically the Second Baptist Missionary Baptist Church.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And a lot of churches were often referred to as missions before they were, got the shorthand of just churches. So you'd have the Baptist mission, the Methodist mission, the Lutheran mission. And that wasn't some outreach center. It was the church itself. And so missions is integral to the church, particularly the Baptist church. And I'm sure my Methodist friends as well. And really from a necessity's sake, it's not that we were some option. There was nowhere else to go. If you're not getting assistance, if you're not getting help, if you're not a place of meeting and development or mentorship or life skills or home ec or all the things we call it now, if you weren't getting that in a Black church, in the Black community, or some extension of a Black church or group of church people, you weren't getting it, And so we have to remember that your nonprofits or your outreach mechanisms, however they existed or formed in those days, they were segregated and subject to the divisions of our world as the rest of the world, as the corporate world and the educational world. So when I would talk to my older members, I mean, I have 90-year-old members, 104-year-old member, 105-year-old member who are still in their right mind and can tell me that they had nowhere else to go unless they had a church to go to that was more than just a church. And that's why there was so much church in the day, because you could have like Monday night service and Wednesday night service and Friday night service and 2 services on Saturday. They would have young people service in the evening, and then because where else are you going? Mm-hmm. So outreach is integral and inherent to the Black church. At least it was historically. Now, I think that as the world opened up to African American populations, outreach became more of a choice. And when the idea of integration and options and the idea that you can spread yourself out and go wherever you want, and you're not tied to this out of either cultural expectation, everybody got to go to a church. There was a time when you couldn't be a part of an organization or a nonprofit if you couldn't claim your church home. Masonic lodges, NAACP, all that. Where do you go to church? Can your pastor vouch for you? Are you in good standing? Which means you give enough money. All that stuff. But when that started to go away, now outreach becomes more of a choice. And the Black church historically has been affected, and I would say infected sometimes, by some of the modern Christian tropes you see on TV and stuff, where, as my grandmother would say, when I would ask her, what happened? Like, you tell all these stories about everybody being together and, sharing eggs out the window and all that. And she would say, well, good jobs and houses and cars came. Everybody got a little something, and we didn't need each other anymore. Mm-hmm. We didn't need to band together to have a meal. We didn't need to share hand-me-downs. We didn't need to do that. That's like your 60s, 70s-ish kind of stuff. GM, all that. Mm-hmm. And so now you have to be intentional. And some of those cultural expectations to be a part of religion or to be a part of a Christian community are not always there. So you have to be intentional about reaching out. And that's become a hard track, I think, for a community that was so automatic in its patterns. And now it's not automatic anymore. And we're actually several generations past that. So African Americans actually sometimes have a hard time with outreach and evangelism, because I'm probably the last generation, and only part of our generation was, hey, you just get up and go to church and you're going to be good Christians and that's what you do. Now I have to go try to talk to these people who've never been to church in their life, and they look like me, they sound like me, but we don't all have the same morals and values at the same time. So watching that trajectory, I've wanted to live in the legacy that Second had of the necessity, but also the choice of being a light and an impact in the community in a real way. And we've done that through the grace of God in so many ways. I mean, our monthly food distribution has been going on for decades, of groceries. We actually assisted my second year at the church in gathering grants and funding with the help of Trumbull Neighborhood Partnership and our local housing authority to get a playground built in the housing area next door to us, where it was just, overrun with grass and weeds and nothing for the children. That's outreach. Church itself is an outreach in a distressed community, where if you have kids willing to get up at 9 a.m. in the morning and walk themselves to church because they want to be somewhere safe, where they're loved and they're respected, and they might have some figures that are positive they might not have in their homes or neighborhood, that's automatically an outreach that will form their lives. And so I've always wanted Second to be that. That's why I kind of gave us the moniker A House of Hope, so that in the midst of all the distress and even destruction we see around us, people would see sort of a beacon, and we go out to them where they are, and we invite them to come in and be a part of us.
So the church was founded in 1916.
Mm-hmm.
The first chapel was on Walnut Street in 1919.
Yes, ma'am.
What year was your current building built?
So the current building, again, the need for more space. There is property purchased on Main Street, and there were like a lot of houses, and even the housing area was bigger at the time, or ended up getting built bigger around there. And in 1956, they broke ground on the new Second Baptist, which here's another Black history factoid about Black churches. Whenever they would make a move, they would change the name of the church to Greater. So it became the Greater Second Baptist Church, Greater Second Missionary Baptist Church. Uh-huh. And because it's greater, it's bigger. The church is spilling out. You can't even fit the people in the church anymore on Walnut Street. And it was time. And again, Warren was exploding in the 50s. 40s, 50s, and 60s. It's exploding. And so they built the church, and it remained a basement church for the first 4 years. They had church in the basement. So the space that we would now call our fellowship hall and classrooms and a kitchen and a daycare was a sanctuary. And we have pictures of that still. I can send them to you if you don't have them.
Please.
And on Easter Sunday in 1960, they opened up the main level sanctuary that we have now. And the whole time they were raising money and doing that whole thing. There was even a wedding that day. And that couple is still alive. They live in Colorado and watch our services every Sunday.
That's amazing.
Yeah. The Holiness are their last names, I believe. Holiness or Holiness. And they got married that Sunday after church, and some 1,000 people walked through the building that day and just viewed this marvel, again, in the Black community, built by Black people, that was a marvel at the time. It wasn't your old clapboard church, your old brick church. Everybody had the same kind of little building. It was something different, architecturally beautiful and all of that. And that was such a pride of achievement for the community. And that lasted to this day. And we've just been building upon and growing. It's a wonderful space, and it carries with it so much weight of legacy. That great-grandfather I mentioned, who was a pastor, his church was a little small church down the street. When he died in 1965, the service was at Second Baptist. So there's just so much roots in that place.
Yeah. So when they moved the original church, when they moved the original chapel, when they moved the chapel to the site of Second Baptist, can you talk a little bit about why you think they kept it, why they didn't just demolish the building, and I'm also kind of curious if your current congregation sees value in that, in keeping the chapel.
Well, I'll answer the last question first. Sure. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's something you had to come to over time, because sometimes when something's just old in its day, you don't think that way. But then decades down the line, I wish I had kept that, that heirloom or that, whatever, that picture. And so I think they feel the same way. But we did not technically keep the church right away. I'm a little shaky on whether it was sold or rented out. But as a part of the urban redevelopment, at first, it was rented out to another church, a Pentecostal church called Tabernacle Church of God in Christ. And Eli Holman was the pastor there. And that is where he started Eli's barbecue rib business in that church.
Connections.
There's connections everywhere. Exactly. So at some later time, and I think it was more late 60s, as urban redevelopment was advancing, and some of those stalwart buildings just couldn't stay anymore. I'm not sure if it was either repurchased or just more or less reclaimed, because you know how property things can be in old days. We're like, who owns this? They basically recaptured and started looking into ways to preserve the building. And in the 70s, they found a way and a plan and financing and even grants to relocate that church from 109 Walnut Street to 1512 Main Avenue, right beside our church at 1510. And it was put up on a truck and jacked up off of its foundation. They moved power lines. It was a procession. There were kids and adults coming out, walking up and down Main Street as this, and it took hours. I think we saw it recently at this house in Howland. It took hours to move it slowly down the street and then set it on a new foundation that was laid down by a gentleman, Mr. Cowyen, who recently passed, who was a well-known Black Mason worker in the city. And I was honored to do his funeral at Second Baptist because he had laid the foundation for our new church, our old church, to sit on a new foundation. Right. And so it just kind of sat there for a while. And over time, different pastors would come in and kind of make sure it was clean and still used. And it was used for classes and meetings. When I was a little boy, going back to attending church with some friends, I went to a Boy Scout meeting there. And one of my current deacons who have recently retired, he was the scoutmaster, and they used the chapel for the, what they call the races, the slot car, derby, or the slot car, box derby. Box derby, yeah. And you had the little tracks in there. And so it was used for all of that stuff. And then up until my tenure, it was used for a food giveaway. And it had been renovated again, and the members had gotten together and bought new furniture, new pews, new carpet and all in the 90s. But about halfway into my tenure, it had really started to show its wear again. The food ministries and all that had really taken their toll, and we had to kind of move away from that. And then we suffered some vandalism, and we had about 5 windows bust out, and they were historic stained glass windows. And it took us about 2 years to find the right workers and the funding to get those restored. But to the value point, now it stands as a testament as one of, if not the oldest, standing original Black church building in Trumbull County, of, again, where we come from. I mean, the fact that people who likely are the children of slaves or grandchildren of slaves may have made their way up here and put that together. That means something. And so our hope and goal is this spring, as we kick off this renovation project, is to go back into that church. Now, our congregation has kind of recovered a little bit, and they used to have old time service over there. I'm not sure if I could fit everybody in our church in there anymore. But I do intend to hold service and remember where we come from, and have old piano in there, an old organ in there, and do it old school style without all the new modern stuff. And it's a good way to have that living history right among you. Not have someone tell you your story, but to be the story.
I love that.
That's really well said.
It's very powerful.
Yeah.
I think I'm a little bit different than some historians. I always ask like the future questions. So this will be my second future question. Where do you see Second Baptist 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now?
I believe that Second Baptist is going to continue to be a pillar ministry. And that's what I walked into. And that's why I felt the call, because it represents almost like a beam of the community. Like, if this does not stand, our community cannot be in good shape. Period. And I believe that, like our friends at Grace and some of our other legacy churches, while times change and there's a lot of challenges associated with that, my goal is to make sure that we are a bridge between the past, the present, and the future. I'm really grateful that over my 8 years, they have allowed me, and I have been so grateful to have them, to do that. To bridge the old and the new, the young and the old. I walked into a church where a lot of the younger people had kind of drifted, and to see how we have grown out of that, even though population dips and, economics have dipped and all of that. I think out of the 26 or 27 people I baptized last year, maybe 3 or 4 of them were over the age of 50. And a lot of them were teenagers and young adults. And we have 7 more coming this month. To me, that's the legacy I want to see. I want to see generations carrying on legacy, and never forget that in subcultures, particularly ethnic or racial subcultures, sometimes you're all you have. You're all you have to preserve your culture. You're all you have to maintain your culture and tell the story of who you are. And second stands as that. As much as we'll be modern and renovate, and I got screens and video and all that, the brick and the mortar and the souls and the hearts are what the real story is. And I want people to carry that story as they meet the challenges of the next generation.
We talk about that a bit when we do programming for the Historical Society. I often mention that, the buildings are important, but the people that built those buildings and the families that lived in those buildings, they're if not as important, more important in some ways.
When we came to our 100th anniversary in 2016, it was my first year there, my first full year there. We had this banner made that had all the pastors on it. 13 pastors, however many it was, and all of our faces on it. And one wise old lady said, "Where are the people?" She said, "Don't forget." And I was young, and I needed to hear that. Yeah. And she said, "Don't forget the people that made the church." There were a lot of pastors that came and went, or they moved away or whatever happened. But people kept this thing going in tough times. People, families, people that names aren't on walls. And they don't have a pew or a window dedicated to them, but their pennies and their nickels and their dimes and their service and their sacrifice is why we still have that church.
That's, I think, a very good point to leave on.
I will also do, are there any things that you just, Meg usually says this, so I'll let it go.
I was just going to say.
Yeah, is there anything else you want just the audience to know about Second Baptist, about yourself, about anything?
Yeah.
Any programs that the church is going on?
Anything coming up?
Yeah, any events?
Well, we've always got something coming up. I mean, you can come to church any Sunday at 10 a.m. and or Easter and all of that. But I want to say something a little bit broader, and I usually say this around Black History Month, and especially to my white peers. And that is, if you're looking for Black history, it's all around you. And while we're putting up posts and pictures and putting on programs, there are at least 10, 12 churches in this city that are Black history. And at any given Sunday, if you walk into that church, you're walking into Black history. And if we truly want to engage our culture in the same way you walk into an Italian restaurant or a Greek, whatever, we need to engage as a culture and a community outside of these special days and months and holidays and really get to know each other, because we still, 100 and some years later, for our Grace friends, 150 years later, still feel very much like an isolated culture. And that pains me a bit. I'm a council person. I have people that will vote for me, but they never come to my church. And so we have to remember that some of those cultural differences and racial differences still do exist, and we have to be intentional. And I want to say, from the flip side, African Americans over time have learned and done that, where you will find about 15-20% of African American Christians go to predominantly white churches, whereas less than 2% of white Christians would ever consider attending a Black church.
That's interesting.
Same gospel, might be a little different, but we're used to being fish out of water all the time too. So whatever, that's when people say, well, I feel strange. I'm like, how do you think I feel every single day? I feel strange everywhere. It's not my culture, but I'd like us to be seen as a full part of the story of our community and our city and our national history, and not just a holiday or a month. And again, the church still occupies that very, very important space in Black culture and history.
Well said.
Yeah, that's the best note to end on, I think.
Agreed.
Right there. Yeah, that's good.
Agreed.
So, thank you very much for joining us today.
It's a
Thank
pleasure.
you. I'm just so privileged. I love talking about our church and about our history, and I appreciate the opportunity to do it.
Absolutely.
It's been great. Thanks.
Thank you.
For this month's object highlight, we actually have several of them in our collection. A couple of them are photographs of Second Baptist's congregation, and then some of them are photographs of the Sunbeam Choir from 1943. So we'll post those on our page. But then also in our collection is a program for Marian Anderson at Packard Music Hall, which was sponsored by Second Baptist Church in 1958. And for those of you that don't know who Marian Anderson is, which I needed to do a little bit of research for it in the first place, I wanted to read a brief bio of her so you get a sense of why this program is important in the first place and why it's significant that we have it in our collection. Marian Anderson was an American singer. She performed a wide range of music, from opera to spirituals. Anderson performed with renowned orchestras in major concerts and recital venues throughout the United States and Europe between 1925 and 1965. Anderson was an important figure in the struggle for African American artists to overcome racial prejudice in the United States during the mid-20th century. In 1939, during the period of racial segregation, the DAR refused to allow Anderson to sing an integrated audience in Constitution Hall in Washington, D.C. The incident placed Anderson in the spotlight of the international community on a level unusual for a classical musician. With the aid of First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt and her husband, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Anderson performed a critically acclaimed open-air concert on Easter Sunday, April 9th, 1939, on the Lincoln Memorial steps in the Capitol. This event was featured in a documentary film, Marian Anderson, The Lincoln Memorial Concert. She sang before an integrated crowd of more than 75,000 people and a radio audience in the millions.
Wow, that's incredible.
It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, that's awesome. So the program with Marian Anderson and the photos will be linked to the page show notes, but you can also find the program through our website or by searching our catalog at Online Collection Software, which you can view through our website as well.
Thank you once again for listening
Thank you.
and your support.
Next time.
Bye.